Well, Mead, Juanetta, thanks so much for inviting me. Thank you for that introduction, Mead. It's good to see a number of friends again, and there are a few names here I don't know. Nice meeting you, at least virtually. So what I thought I'd do is give you a quick overview of the most recent U.S. strategy document relating to the Arctic, and then talk a little bit, as Mead was suggesting, about how we're trying to build it out and actually get it implemented. So 4 times in our nation's history, we've actually put pen to paper as a federal government and written down what we think our Arctic priorities are. First was under President Clinton, the second time the one Mead referred to in the latter part of the George W. Bush administration, next in Barack Obama's second term, and most recently, the National Strategy for the Arctic Region in 2022 came out last October. I'd like to talk a little bit about how it was produced, because I think that's as important as what it says. There was a very significant effort to do what Mead was suggesting, to hear from the people on the ground in Alaska, all the different interests there, from the state itself, from civil society, private sector, from scientists and academics, from the Alaska Native community, get a sense of what their priorities were, and try to fold those in as best we can, recognizing that this was a plan for the federal government. Nevertheless, if we hope to get it implemented, we're going to need partners. And those people, those groups I just mentioned, are among the many partners we, of course, need and want to work with. The strategy is not only about domestic issues in the U.S. Arctic and Alaska, but also looks in a circumpolar sense to the international sphere of the Arctic. You know, we started working on this pretty much from the start of the Biden administration, and it was almost ready to come out in February of 2022. 2022, last year. In retrospect, it's probably a good thing it didn't come out then, because of course, the invasion of Ukraine, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine that happened toward the latter part of that month, changed the equation in any number of ways. And we spent about 6 months trying to figure out what to say about that, how it adjusted our priorities in the Arctic. The plan is intended to last for, the strategy rather, for 10 years. So on the one hand, it couldn't be only about the current moment and dealing with the very significantly changed geopolitical circumstances of the Arctic. But it also couldn't ignore those circumstances. It needed to somehow find a balance. And I think we did okay in that regard. Taking a step back, well, there are 4 pillars to the strategy. The first deals with security, particularly national security, which has always been a chief imperative for the United States, looking at the Arctic, perhaps more so now even than before. The second deals with climate change and other environmental protection issues. The third pillar deals with economic development, particularly in the state of Alaska, but not only, looking Arctic-wide also. And the final pillar has to do with the sort of international relations, cooperation, and governance. The first sentence of the strategy says that the United States seeks an Arctic region that is peaceful, stable, prosperous, and cooperative. Peaceful, stable, prosperous, and cooperative. That was written before the invasion of Ukraine last year. And one of the debates we had was whether that should remain the lead sentence. And there were some who felt like it ought not to be. But in the end, we kept it. We felt that that is still the goal, still the end state we want, still the signal we wish to send to others, and including to ourselves and to people in the United States, even if aspects of that will be harder to attain given the current circumstances of the Arctic. Beyond that, I would say, I worked on the last 2 U.S. Arctic policy statements during the Obama years and during the George W. Bush years. And what strikes me most is not their differences, but their similarities. the same basic ideas tend to keep coming up regardless of the political orientation of the administration. Yeah, there are differences in emphasis, but I think it's a testament to the enduring and long-term interest we have as a nation in the Arctic. We want to keep it peaceful. We want to protect its environment. We want to allow it to develop sustainably. We want to understand it better. We want to involve Arctic indigenous peoples, including Alaska Natives, in decisions that affect them. Indeed, we have many types of commitments to do that. So these are some of the themes that you will see threaded through this national strategy that are really in all of them. And I think that's a good thing, that we don't swing wildly back and forth depending on the political orientation of the day. So those are, that's a little bit about the strategy itself. Since it came out in October, we have been trying to flesh it out. The document itself is only about a dozen pages long. And while it sets sort of high-level goals and priorities, it's not what I would call operational in nature. If you look at it, there's some 40 or 50 sentences in it that begin with the words "we will," meaning the federal government will do X, Y, and Z. We are now nearly completed. We have now nearly completed what we're calling an implementation plan for the national strategy. I hope it'll be ready in less than a month. And it's about 50 pages long. For each of those "we will" sentences, it will have in it a series of next steps, concrete next steps to be taken over the next couple of years, an identification of which of the federal agencies are lead or co-leads, which are supporting. There's language in each case about how we will measure progress toward achieving the goals. And there's an identification of potential external partners, meaning external to the federal government. And in many cases, those include the state of Alaska, Alaska indigenous groups, civil society in Alaska, and of course, other governments outside the United States. In building out the implementation plan, we also have gotten input from some of the same people. And I should have mentioned, we have kept our people in Congress who care about the Arctic, including the Alaska congressional delegation, but certainly not only them, informed of all this and seeking their counsel in this as well. So I'm hoping that we will have an implementation plan to share with you and everyone else. As I said, within a month or so, it's in the final stages of clearance. It's been a bear to bring together, I will admit. It's not an easy thing to do. And yet there does seem to be a sincere willingness to work harder on Arctic issues. We do have, thanks to some money that Congress has appropriated, some funds with which to do some of the things we have imagined. For example, Congress passed the so-called bipartisan infrastructure law, which has all sorts of funding for different things. It's, of course, to be spent nationwide, but chunks of it are earmarked in a sense for Alaska, including, for example, building out broadband and other connectivity, working on other infrastructure type issues, helping with sort of environmental related things. And speaking of the environment, a second law, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, has also provided significant new money for working on environmental and climate related issues nationwide, including in Alaska. Now, the last thing I'd say is we have engaged regularly with the state government of Alaska, primarily through both the previous Lieutenant Governor, Kevin Meyer, and the current Lieutenant Governor, Meyer Nancy Dahlstrom. Our pitch to them, my pitch to them, is that, despite the political differences that may exist between the federal government and the state government, there surely are things that we are working on together and can work on together more, where do differently or better. And we're trying to figure out what those are. In an ideal world, we would be partners in trying to tackle some of the issues that the state faces and try to seize on some of the opportunities in the Arctic that are before us. So I could go on, but maybe Juanetta, I might just stop there and see what's on everybody else's mind and maybe turn this more into a dialogue. What do you think?
All right, sounds good. Thank you, David. We typically offer our board members an opportunity to ask questions live. So I'm going to bring Mead back in. And Mead, if you'd like to start off, we'll go with that.
So thanks, David. Just a quick schedule issue. Are you're planning to actually produce or release an implementation plan soon?
Yeah, I can't say exactly when. You know how these clearance things go, but I'm hoping within a month from today.
Okay. And just in terms of talking about general consensus, I would say that the state of Alaska and tribes have developed a stronger relationship in recent years, probably since the last strategy. That we've made good progress on at least one icebreaker and port funding out in Nome. We've certainly, there's other science infrastructure projects that are going forward. And I would just say to the group here, there's the fact that Dave is sitting at OSTP, the fact that there's also an interagency coordinator, an interagency committee that's coordinated by an Alaskan, Larry Hinsman, is that structurally, with Senator Murkowski's help and others, we've worked to build the structure there. I guess the question is, on the peaceful part with Russia, how do you, what do you think we need to do to maintain that? We have some things that are going on between the Coast Guard and Russia right now. We have some huge data gaps. What do you see coming out in the implementation plan on that, or how can we be helpful there?
Yeah, that's probably the hardest question, and the one for which I have the hardest time giving an answer. Suffice to say that the situation with Russia is terrible right now. There is very little space to cooperate between the US government and the Russian government. There are some limited exceptions. You mentioned one of them, Mead. Some of Coast Guard operations, particularly on emergency things and search and rescue and the like, are continuing. The space station is still up in the sky, and there are a few other things that where we can continue working with Russia, but mostly not. And it represents a very significant departure. As you well know, and others who've been following Arctic issues know well, we have been able to cooperate with Russia, ever since the end of the Cold War, actually even during the Cold War to some extent in the Arctic, but certainly since the end of the Cold War, on all sorts of things. Those agreements that you mentioned coming through the Arctic Council process were co-led in each case by an American and a Russian. Despite the fact that there was a lot of static in the relationship going back to 2014, even before. But with the invasion of Ukraine last year, all that has changed. Looking ahead, which is what you're asking about, I don't have a crystal ball. A lot of it depends on how and when the war in Ukraine comes to an end. In an ideal world, that would happen soon and on reasonable terms, such that we could get back to cooperating with Russia. It's clear to me that in order to realize our own goals in the Arctic fully, we do need to work with the Russians, even if we don't necessarily get along on everything. But we can't do that now. The private sector has some more ability, but be careful. There are sanctions in place, and sometimes interacting with private Russians can get them in trouble with their own government. That we've seen that happen too. But somehow keeping a pilot light burning in hopes of a better tomorrow is a good strategy. I don't know if I answered your question, Maybe that's best I could say.
No, I think that's fair. I guess I guess one other corollary I'd have that question before turning to others is, after being at a kind of a think group that you were involved with earlier this week, I was at a military discussion. And to the extent that I came back, probably the next Arctic program we're going to recommend for Commonwealth North is just basically a threat assessment that we look at the Arctic, because there's some fairly scary things there with cruise missiles, and some fairly important things that we're doing with both the Coast Guard and the military. And I don't think Alaskans have been exposed to that as well, and so I think that'll be interesting. Yeah. Juanetta, I'm going to hand it back to you, and you put spotlight the next folks. But David, thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
All right, thanks, Mead. Any other board members online? Tom, Bernie, or Gail Schubert? Okay, we do have a question in chat. David, Randy Sweet is online with us, and she's asking, how is the blue economy fitting into the Arctic region strategy?
So the blue economy is kind of a big concept. It could cover a lot of different things, at least as I understand it. The notion, though, is to, and not just in the Arctic, but including in the Arctic, help to diversify economies by looking at ocean-related opportunities. And yeah, with the melting of sea ice and other environmental change, which is mostly bad news, come along a number of opportunities. Probably the most obvious one has to do with shipping. We have seen some increase in shipping into and out of the Arctic, not so much through the Arctic. And that is likely to continue. Although, as long as problems with Russia remain, it's not obvious to me how much traffic will actually be going through the Northern Sea route over the top of Russia. But Arctic shipping is going to continue to increase. Maybe it won't become, the alternative to the Panama and Suez Canal anytime very soon. And there are some very serious limitations on Arctic shipping related to port charting and port infrastructure generally. And yet I think that's one growth area. Some people point to, as a subset of shipping or related to shipping, blue tourism. There are more people going up to parts of the Arctic, not just in Alaska, but elsewhere. That is helping to diversify economies that have typically relied on other things. Fisheries are changing, both in and around the state of Alaska, but elsewhere. The warming of ocean waters and other changes of the ocean environment are causing shifts in population, some good, some very bad. But that may allow for some kind of blue economy growth. Anyway, there are any number of things that where the changing Arctic might be sources of economic diversity and economic growth heading into the future.
I'm just going to leverage off that question and your answer a little bit, David. One of the things that we learned some years ago in the Gulf of Alaska with the Selendang Ayu incident near Unalaska was how little knowledge we had of maritime marine activity along the Great Circle route as it comes close to Alaska. And one of the things, there was an Aleutian Life Symposium that resulted from that, thinking about what are the things that we need to do to prepare as a region. And one of the pieces that came out of that was some evidence, some research that it's not necessarily the big incident that creates the most environmental damage, but sort of the paper cuts, the repeated paper cut incidents that are small, but may result in, some sort of debris or emissions or something into the environment. And so just thinking along those lines, is there anything in the implementation strategy that is maybe anticipating that there is going to be this increased level of volume, and how to maybe respond to the paper cut issue?
So let's just tease out a number of different aspects of that. You're certainly right that there's so much we don't know, even about the current circumstances facing the marine environment off Alaska. not to mention the trajectory of things heading into the future. We do have some new tools at our disposal, and yes, the implementation plan for the strategy is going to call for and lay out next steps to help, improve our understanding of what's actually going on in the marine environment. Yes, you're right that probably the paper cuts or the cumulative effects of smaller incidents may, in some objective sense, be a bigger problem. But it's also true that catastrophic incidents, an Exxon Valdez or similar, have different types of consequences and sometimes spur different kinds of action. Sometimes it takes a catastrophe to get human beings to sort of react as we need to. I think a lot of people stay up at night worried that increased traffic through the Bering Strait, not only through the Aleutians Great Circle route, but through the Bering Strait, especially on the Russian side, could yield some sort of environmental disaster, which would immediately affect the U.S. side as well, and especially given the challenges of working with Russia on things like that at the moment, makes it even worse.
Okay, thank you. Well, just a last call out to the audience. We've got about 5 more minutes with Ambassador Balton. If you have any questions, to submit them through the chat. Tom, I'm going to call on you. You and Meade and Gail Schubert recently met with representatives from the Navy about their interests in Alaska. And I'm just wondering, based on your experience, both with Alaska Pipeline and the U.S. Department of Transportation, if you have any thoughts about some of these issues with the development of an implementation plan for the Arctic strategy and increased maritime traffic.
Yeah, so the Navy is the Northwest Commander. I mean, he's clearly up here. You've got Northern Edge just starting up here. You've got activities in the Gulf of Alaska, more significant Navy presence, aviation, obviously. And I think they're trying to figure out ways. I think they're going to be more present up here, and they're looking at what the Navy role is. Historically, hasn't been that much on the surface or overhead, more just like submarines. But I think it wasn't part of our discussion. I think Dave has all the background on this in a lot of ways. I have a concern about the engagement, and Meade mentioned, I wasn't at Church's most recent thing, but there's more Russian military guard presence out in waters. We're moving more Navy presence up there. In the back of my head is like a KAL 007 shoot down. It's the risk of, since you've got more presence on both sides, the risk of accidents happening, and particularly we've got communication challenges with them. I think that's an understated risk, not the confront risk, but the risk of misreading intentions or accidents happening, and it's spiraling into something that's potentially catastrophic, because we've also been unraveling our treaties, our nuclear treaties and stuff like that. So Dave, I don't really have any opinion. It's just I always look at risks, whether it was the pipeline or or Coast Guard stuff. You're always trying to figure what's the risk profile and how's it changing. And I think we've talked about commercial shipping and managing some of the risks there. But I think the risk from activity increasing on the military side on both sides with poor communications is a risk I hope we're paying enough attention to.
I hope so too, Tom. I certainly agree that the risk you are outlining is probably the biggest one currently. I don't think we're likely to be going to war in the Arctic. I don't think the risk of actual armed conflict has increased so much, except that, as you're saying, the risk of miscalculation, accidental or unintentional engagement, simply because there are more assets up there and we're communicating quite poorly at the moment, has gone up. And I would like to see us finding some ways, as we even did during the Cold War, to bring down those kinds of risks. I'm hoping, over the next few months that might be possible, but the politics are terrible. And anything that would have to be done quietly. I think you could appreciate it.
Well, I'm glad you're there, and I'm counting on you to do it.
Hey, can I add just one thing? I learned just the other day that Governor Copeland has left the governorship of Chukotka. And he was somebody who is pretty well tied into what was going on in Moscow as related to the Arctic and so forth. And I'm not even sure who his successor is now, but Juanetta can tell you that we had a number of communications with him to try to get him before this Arctic, inquiry at Commonwealth North. And having lost that, we're really down now to relying on even just families who have relations across the streets.
Yeah, it's not a good situation. That's clear.
Yeah, we have one more question, David.
Okay.
Just considering Rhea Hansen is online with us, and she's asking, considering that Sweden and Finland have recently joined or in the process of joining NATO, is the security question in the Arctic essentially a NATO versus Russia plus their allies question, or is there exploration of trying to keep an Arctic security discussion separate from the global NATO-Russian dynamics?
Yeah, boy, that's a hard question to answer in 1 minute. I don't believe that Sweden and Finland joining NATO I don't see it primarily through an Arctic lens. NATO does have a role in the Arctic, but mostly NATO thinks about areas south of the Arctic, and that is probably as it should be.
Mm-hmm.
And what we don't necessarily need in the Arctic is more confrontation with Russia. There's enough of it already. And yet the fact that 7 of the 8 Arctic states will be in NATO once Sweden actually does join will undoubtedly change the dynamic, at least some. Again, there's a lot more that could be said about it, but I know we're at time. Maybe I should leave it there.
Yeah. Well, I know you've got a hard stop, and so I'm going to bring Mead back in again, but I'll just say thanks. And Mead, if you have any closing comments or remarks.
David, when you have the new strategy, I'm sure we'll all see it, but we'll have a chance to maybe invite you back.
Okay.
We've got, I guess Norway's just taken over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council.
Yesterday, yes.
As it were, the 7/8 Arctic Council plus observers. And we've talked a lot about how the observers might be helpful in the situation. And so that's going to be something to watch. And I guess the offer I'd make to you from Commonwealth North is if there are particular areas, I mean, the biggest difference between, say, state policy and federal policy right now is the state is determined to address climate change without totally eliminating fossil fuels if we can work that through a number of different ways that we're working on that. And that usually doesn't show up in Arctic policy, except that when you talk about except that there are some places where it could.
It does.
So you'll probably hear more from Commonwealth North about those kinds of issues as time goes on. And we've got some constraints on renewables and shipping issues there too. So anyway, with that, thank you for being a friend of this organization and a friend of many of the people on the call. And you're welcome back at this podium anytime. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Mead. Thanks, Juanetta. Nice to see you all. Hope to talk to you again soon.
Likewise. Thanks for being with us today. Thank you, Mead and Tom and everyone for being with us. Just a brief reminder, we have a program coming up May 24th, the Alaska Assets Program, which is one of our legacy programs looking at the value of the entire portfolio of Alaska assets and what that means for Alaskans. That'll be at the Petroleum Club at noon at the lunch program. Hope you can join us for that. And with that, I'll wish everybody a good Friday and a happy weekend and hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.